All right, let's get right into it. When most of us think of the American Revolution, our minds usually jump straight to, battlefields, muskets, and dramatic midnight rides. But if we really dive into James Graham's historical accounts, we see that the true foundation of this historic shift wasn't actually forged on the battlefield at all. It was this massive intellectual and deeply political earthquake. So today, in this analysis, we're going to unpack the real political origins of the United States. We'll look at why the leaders of the time actually fought and the fundamental underlying reasons for this incredible societal change. But before we get into the conflict itself, we really have to stop and ask ourselves a pretty crucial question. What if the revolution wasn't actually inevitable? We tend to look at history in reverse, right? We just kind of assume that because something happened, it was always destined to happen. But the truth is, for a really long time, the colonists proudly considered themselves British subjects. This was absolutely not some eager rebellion. It was an incredibly reluctant divorce. The tensions grew slowly, and the idea of completely breaking away was, for years, just a radical fringe concept. So here's our roadmap for today. 1. The origins of the conflict. 2. The spark of change. 3. Perspectives of political leaders. 4. The conflicts of 1776. And 5. The legacy of the revolution. Starting off with Section 1, the origins of the conflict. Think about how incredibly condensed the timeline of these historical events actually is. In 1763, the British Empire is celebrating their victory in the 7 Years' War. But here's the catch. That massive global war practically bankrupted the crown. So, just 2 years later, in 1765, the Stamp Act is introduced to help pay down that astronomical debt. Well, that sparks immediate organized resistance. That leads to the First Continental Congress in 1774, and then, boom, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. An imperial relationship that had lasted for centuries completely unraveled in just 13 years.
And the core friction here wasn't just about paying a few extra pennies for a stamp. It was a fundamental disagreement over sovereignty itself. The British Crown believed in a strict top-down model where Parliament was supreme. The colonists, on the other hand, who were very used to managing their own local affairs by this point, had a completely different definition of what fair representation actually meant. It was essentially a collision of two entirely incompatible political realities.
Moving right along to Section 2, the spark of change. Now, philosophical disagreements are one thing, but everyday disruptions, those are what actually spark a rebellion. The rallying cry of no taxation without representation really struck at the heart of their property rights. Add to that a permanent military presence during peacetime, which, by the way, was seen as an intimidating, occupying force rather than any sort of protection, and a complete lack of an authentic voice in Parliament, the colonists really felt they were being downgraded from proud subjects with rights to just subjects of arbitrary power. And it's absolutely vital to remember the number 13 here. We are talking about 13 historically independent colonies that had wildly varied perspectives. I mean, a farmer in Massachusetts and a plantation owner in Virginia lived in entirely different cultural worlds. They definitely didn't naturally see themselves as one unified people. The true political miracle of this era was how these 13 totally different entities somehow forged a shared political identity to push back. Which brings us to Section 3, Perspectives of Political Leaders. If you were sitting in a tavern in the 1770s, you'd likely hear two completely incompatible political philosophies clashing. The British Parliament was arguing for virtual representation. They sincerely believed they represented the entire empire, regardless of who actually cast a ballot. Colonial leaders, though, demanded direct representation. Their argument was pretty straightforward. If we didn't elect you, you literally have no legitimate authority to tax us or pass laws governing our daily lives. And we've got to remember, many leaders were actually deeply reluctant to declare independence. The loyalist or moderate perspective was rooted in a very genuine, understandable fear of total chaos. As they warned, a separation would bring ruin and desolation. The British Empire was the greatest superpower on Earth at the time. Severing ties meant risking economic collapse, a bloody civil war, and losing military protection on the frontier. On the flip side, we have the radical patriot perspective. They argue that our liberties are not a granted privilege, but an inalienable right. They genuinely believe that political rights weren't some gift from a king that could just be taken away. To them, establishing a new sovereign government wasn't just a political option, it was a strict moral obligation. And the intense friction between these two viewpoints is exactly what makes the politics of this era so electrifying. All right, on to Section 4, the conflicts of 1776. 1776 was the year those philosophical tensions finally boiled over into structural reality, and the revolution was ultimately a radical shift in one specific concept: sovereignty. For centuries, ultimate power radiated outward from London. The monumental shift of 1776 was this totally audacious demand that supreme authority actually originates at the local level and is driven entirely by the consent of the people living there.
It's fascinating to see how power was forcibly decentralized. Before 1776, governors got their authority directly from the British Crown. After 1776, that authority was claimed by the people and local assemblies. Laws and taxes used to be dictated by a parliament thousands of miles away. Suddenly, they were only considered legitimate if passed by direct, local representatives. This wasn't just a tweak to the system, it was a complete rewiring of how a society functioned.
And this is exactly why 1776 matters so deeply. The true revolution wasn't just the battles at Lexington or Yorktown. It was the definitive death of an ancient monarchical paradigm and the birth of a democratic republic. The muskets and cannons were, in a way, merely the tools used to defend this massive intellectual leap.
Finally, Section 5. The Legacy of the Revolution.
Because the foundational debates of 1776 definitely didn't end in the 18th century, they are literally the bedrock of modern political discourse today. The balance between centralized and local power, that is alive and well in every major democracy. We are still debating the true definition of fair representation every single election cycle. And most importantly, they enshrined the fundamental right to question and challenge governmental authority when it no longer serves the public good.
So as we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you with this to consider. How do these reluctant, complex political struggles of 1776 continue to echo in our modern politics right now? The revolution wasn't a neat, tidy event. It was a messy, passionate debate over power, representation, and liberty that, honestly, we're still figuring out today. Thanks for joining me to unpack James Graham's history. Catch you next time.